Today's lesson comes from section 11.4. It's on adding and subtracting radical expressions. Objective 1 is to identify like and unlike radicals. So we are going to just compare like radicals versus unlike radicals. If you notice underneath like radicals, I have in red highlighted, standing out, that like radicals have the same radicand. And the radicand is actually the number that's underneath the radical. That might be something that you would want to write down. So I starred radicand is the number underneath the radical for you to put in your notes. Alright, so let's go ahead and identify some like radicals. 2 radical 3 and negative 4 radical 3. Notice the number underneath the radical in both these cases is 3, so those are like. You would be able to combine them. 3 radical 6 and negative radical 6. Again, the number underneath the radical, 6 and 6, those are the same, so you'd be able to combine them. Alright, now we're going to get into ones that are a little bit trickier you might not see right off the bat. So 13 radical 7 and 2 radical 28. So 7, 28 don't look like they match, but you can simplify 2 radical 28. 28 becomes 7 and 4. The 4 becomes 2 and 2. And you have a pair of 2's. So we're going to go ahead and pull out those 2's. Those 1 2's get multiplied by the 2 that's already outside. And so 2 radical 28 actually becomes 2 times 2, which is 4. This 7 gets left at home. So 2 radical 28 is actually 4 radical 7, and 13 radical 7 and 4 radical 7 are now like terms. Okay? And then one more example of like radicals. Let's go ahead and do negative radical 12 and negative 12 radical 27. And 12 breaks down into 4 and 3. And the 4 breaks down into 2 and 2. So negative radical 12 becomes, multiply this 2, the pair of 2's by the negative outside. So 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. The 3 stays at home all by himself. So negative radical 12 becomes negative 2 radical 3. And negative 12 radical 27, the 27 breaks down into 9 and 3. 9 becomes 3 and 3. There's a pair of 3's. So I'm going to take that pair of 3's and multiply it by the negative 12 that's outside. And that's negative 36. And there's a 3 left at home, so we have negative 36 radical 3. So negative radical 12 and negative 12 radical 27 are actually like because in simplest form, they both have a 3 underneath the radical. Okay, so now that we know what some like radicals are, let's identify some unlike radicals just to make sure we have this down. So 2 radical 3 and 4 radical 5. Not like because the number underneath the radical is not the same. Negative radical 6 and negative 6 radical 2. Not like because the number underneath the radical is not the same. And last, let's do radical 4 and radical 12. Neither one of these are in simplest form, so the square root of 4 becomes 2. And radical 12 breaks down into 4 and 3, which breaks down into 2 and 2. And so radical 12 becomes 2 radical 3. 2 and 2 radical 3 are not like because 2 has no radical at all, and 2 radical 3 has a 3 underneath the radical. So those terms cannot be combined. Alright, now that we're a little bit more familiar with like radicals and unlike radicals, let's go ahead and actually move on to objective 2. Objective 2 says we want to be able to simplify radical expressions by adding and subtracting. So, in order to do that, we have 3 steps. The first thing you're going to want to do is break down all radicals into simplest form, just like what we were doing with the like radicals and the unlike radicals. First we went through and broke them down just to make sure that we knew if they were like or not like. Alright, the second thing we want to do is we want to circle, underline, or box all like radicals. That way we know which radicals we're actually combining. And then last, we are going to in fact combine all the like radicals by adding or subtracting the number that's in front of the radical and keeping the radicand the same. Okay, so this is actually something that I'm going to compare this to something you should be already familiar with. It's very similar to combining like terms. If I told you to add 2x plus 3x, you would take the number in front of the x and add it. So 2 plus 3 is 5. And then you just drag that x along. So 2x plus 3x would be 5x. Okay, if I gave you x minus 7x, okay, you would put the invisible 1 in front of the x, and then you would tell me 1 minus 7 gives you negative 6, and then you would drag that x along, right? And just like with combining like terms, if I told you 3x plus 4y, you would tell me you couldn't simplify that anymore because the x and the y are not the same. So we're going to use that same concept, that same idea when adding or subtracting like radicals. So let's look at some level 1 questions. That's Roxy shaking her collar. Question number 1 is the square root of 2 plus 3 radical 2. Okay, number in front of the radical 2 is an invisible 1. And we're going to combine those two together. So we're going to add the 1 and the 3. And that's 4. Then just take that radical, drag it along. So this is 4 radical 2. So 1 radical 2 plus 3 radical 2 is 4 radical 2. Okay, your 1A question is negative 3 radical 5 plus 7 radical 5. Okay, and question number 2 is negative radical 5 minus 6 radical 5 plus 7 radical 2 plus 3 radical 5. Okay, this one gets a little bit more tougher because we have more terms, but again, we're going to do the same thing as before. Circle, box, or underline all like terms, so any radicals that have the same number underneath once they're simplified. So we've got negative radical 5, negative 6 radical 5, and 3 radical 5 that are the same. And then the 7 radical 2 we'll work with later. So let's go ahead and add the numbers in front of the radicals. So this is negative 1 minus 6, which is negative 7, plus 3, which is negative 4. Negative 7 plus 3 is negative 4. So we have negative 4 radical 5, because I just dragged that 5 right along underneath the radical sign. And then our last term, which has not been used yet, is plus 7 radical 2. So negative 4 radical 5 plus 7 radical 2 is our final answer because radical 5 and radical 2 are not the same because the number underneath the radical is not like. Your 2A question is 3 radical 2 plus 4 radical 5 minus 7 radical 2 plus 6 radical 5. Okay, and while you're trying that, let's move on to some level 2 questions. Okay, these get a little bit harder because the radicals will not be in complete simplified form. So we're going to have to simplify first and then try to combine like radicals. Okay, so 7 radical 3 minus radical 12. The 3 is as broken down as it can get, but the 12 is not. So let's break down that 12 into 4 and 3. The 4 becomes 2 and 2. I have a pair of 2's. So I'm going to go ahead and bring down 7 radical 3 minus radical 12 becomes 2 radical 3. And so I do 7 minus 2 is 5. Bring that radical 3 along, I get 5 radical 3. Okay, question 4. We're going to do a 3A and 4A question combined. Okay, so question 4 is negative radical 72 plus 2 radical 2. Again, we're going to have to break down that 72 before we try to combine like terms. Okay, so break down the 72. I see 9 and 8. 9 breaks down into 3 and 3. There's a pair of 3's. 8 breaks down into 4 and 2. 4 breaks down into 2 and 2. And there's a pair of 2's. So then I'm going to do 1, 2 times 3 times the negative that's already outside of the radical. So 2 times 3 times negative 1 is negative 6. Left at home was that poor lonely 2, so negative 6 radical 2. Bring down the plus 2 radical 2. And if I combine like terms, I have negative 6 plus 2, because both those radicands are the same. We've got 2 and 2 underneath the radicand. So negative 6 plus 2 is negative 4, and the radicand stays the same. So negative 4 radical 2. Your 3a and 4a question is, let's do 3 radical 20 plus 2 radical 5. Okay, so you can try that one for 3a and 4a. And with that, let's go ahead and move on to some level 3 questions. So questions 5 and 6 are going to be a little bit tougher because we're going to have a lot more breaking down going on, but they're not actually any more difficult, except for the fact that there's a little bit more work. Okay, so conceptually they're about the same level wise. Okay, so 3 radical 3 minus 2 radical 27 plus 4 radical 9. And if we break down all of our numbers into simplest form first, the 3 radical 3 will just stay the same, so I'm going to just bring that one down. And then the 27 breaks down into 9 and 3. 9 breaks down into 3 and 3. And so I have a pair of 3's. And I'm going to go ahead and multiply the 3 times the negative 2. So that's negative 6. Radical, who's left at home? Oh, that poor 3, he's all by himself. Okay, so minus 6 radical 3. And then the 9 over here plus 4 radical 9 breaks down into, the 9 breaks down into 3 and 3. I see a pair, and so I multiply the 3 by the 4, and I get positive 12. And in this case, nobody's left at home, so I'm just going to add 12. So I combine like terms, or like radicals, and that's the radical 3's. So I'm going to do 3 minus 6, which gives me negative 3. Bring that radical 3 down, so negative 3 radical 3. And then I'm going to just go ahead and add the 12 at the end, because it's not like, so it can't be combined with those radical 3's. Okay, so my final answer is negative 3 radical 3 plus 12. Your 5a question for you to try is negative 3 radical 5 minus 4 radical 5 plus 2 radical 16. And your 5a is a little bit easier than my 5, because you don't actually have to break down as much, but that's okay. And question 6, this is our final question for the day. So 5 radical 7 minus radical 16 plus 8 radical 28. And again, we're going to want to simplify first. So 5 radical 7, can't simplify that, I just go ahead and bring it down. The radical 16 breaks down into 4 and 4, or the square root of 16 is also known as 4. So take that 4 outside, it's really just minus 4, no radical at all. And then plus 8 radical 28. 28 breaks down into 7 and 4. 4 breaks down into 2 and 2. And so I have a pair of 2's. And I'm going to multiply that 2 by that positive 8, which gives me positive 16. Radical, oh, who's left at home? That poor 7 is left at home. So plus 16 radical 7. I'm looking for some like terms, and I see 5 radical 7 plus 16 radical 7, both of those are like, so I'm going to add the number out in front. 5 plus the 16 gives me 21 radical 7, and then I'm just going to bring down this minus 4. Can't combine those two, so I'm finished. My final answer is 21 radical 7 minus 4. And your 6a question is radical 10 minus radical 25 plus radical 360. And while you're working on that question, you can think about this fun fact. A skunk can spray its scent more than 10 feet. That would have been handy to know when when poor Roxy got sprayed. All right, have a good night, guys.